Good morning. It is a complete and utter honor to be with you. A decade ago, I met Alberto for the first time, and I have to admit that I wasn't really paying attention to news or local issues. They weren't really in my purview. I was really focused on technology. And it was through a set of conversations that we had that I actually started paying attention, and I got more and more interested in where these intersections occurred. And there's actually many people in this room who kept pushing me, and so it's great to actually be in this room and hopefully to offer something back in return. I'm going to begin today with a little bit of a stretching exercise, because I think it's a moment to take a sort of temperature of this room. How many of you consume news every day? Good, you're in the right room, right? Otherwise, I think if you didn't raise your hand, you might want to exit or you're going to be in trouble. Now, how many of you watch YouTube every day? Okay. How many of you consume your news primarily on YouTube? You're old. I'm going to begin today by actually talking about YouTube. And I'm going to put this at the center of a conversation because as we're talking about what it means to think about community, what it means to think about local, and what it means to think about being informed, we need to talk about the environments that people are paying attention to that are outside of your purview, and we need to pay attention to them in light of the fact that they are being exploited, and that those exploitations are rippling into community in significant ways. Right? Now, a tremendous amount of attention in community and in the field of journalism has been paying attention to Facebook and Twitter and their role in shaping information and complicating that. In fact, they've been dragged into Congress for precisely that reason. But far too few people understand YouTube's role in this environment, let alone the unique vulnerabilities that YouTube has and what that shows for us about the current state of misinformation. Right? So I'm going to start with YouTube, and I'm going to talk through some exploits, and then we'll sort of back out from there to talk about broader states of vulnerabilities within the information landscape and what we can do about it. So if you talk to a young person under the age of 25, you'll quickly learn that they visit YouTube almost every day. It's their MTV, if you will, right? They watch music videos on YouTube. But it's also their primary search engine. Right? Think about that. If you want to go learn how to tie a tie, you go to YouTube. You want to learn how to cook pasta, you go to YouTube. Want to figure out how to do that calculus assignment, go to YouTube. As a result of it being their home search engine and the way in which they get access to information, it's also the place in which many of them start to consume news. They start to pay attention to broader conversations. Now, how many of you watch PewDiePie on a regular basis? How many of you even know what PewDiePie is? Okay, we've got a couple, good. So since 2013, Felix Kjellberg, known as PewDiePie, has had more subscribers on YouTube than anyone else. Right now, he's currently in a contested battle with an Indian Bollywood account, but he has over 87 million subscribers. Right? That's how many people subscribe to his account, not even how many view them. He's a Swede who began posting gaming videos, right, about him having fun doing gaming. But he's actually, over this period, become famous for commenting on culture and social issues. And so for the last year, he's hosted a comedic parody of CNN called Pew News, which he describes as the most respected, trusted news source of all time. Now, millions of people watch each video. Thousands comment on each and every one of them. He is a hero to young white men, including, notably, white nationalists and white supremacists. Now, he vows that he is not a Nazi, but he regularly makes anti-Semitic and racist comments that get shared broadly. He is the most widely watched YouTuber, and that is normal, right? Now, think about that. A gamer who starts commenting on culture becomes the #1 watcher on the primary search engine for under 25s, and it is normal for him to espouse racist and hateful commentary as a way of speaking on a daily basis. Now, most people don't realize how important YouTube is in this intersection. They think about YouTube for watching music videos or Super Bowl ads, but it's actually a more complex environment than that. As I mentioned, it's a search engine. It is also a recommendation engine and a social media site. It has discussion forums, influencers, an autoplay feature that people engage for hours watching the videos on repeat. And it also has significant problems that can be easily exploited, and those exploitations tell us about what's going on today. I'm going to talk about one kind of exploit, an exploit that goes across all sorts of search environments, including YouTube. I want to talk about data voids. Now, this is a concept that Michael Golubieski at Bing used to describe what happens when there's no high-quality information available for a search engine to return. So what happens when you search for something and the search engine doesn't know what to do with it? It's one thing to search for like the basketball, scores. It's another thing to search for something that's kind of esoteric. Well, that's actually where we start to see a moment of exploitation. And if you understand how that's being exploited, you can start to see some of the vulnerabilities that are in our information architecture. So we have 4 different kinds that we're sort of obsessed with, Michael and I, and I'm going to walk you through them. The first is the idea of exploiting breaking news. So when a news story breaks out, you guys, many of you in this room, really get involved in trying to figure out what's going on. But search engines have limited data available to them at first. So on November 5th, 2017, many news outlets blasted a notification to their subscribers. Many of you woke up on that Sunday or saw it that day where you were notified that there was an active shooting in a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Now, the funny thing about a town called Sutherland Springs, Texas, is that to the best that we can tell going through Google and Bing records, 0 people searched for that town in the 2 years before. Even if you're in Texas, you might not know about this town. It's not a popular town. It's very small. So what did they get when they searched for that? They got auto-generated content, right? So they got Zillow content, census content, things that would just sort of fit every town in this country. Google had already pulled that material in as part of its infrastructure, trying to provide something that was there. YouTube had absolutely nothing relevant at all. Now, because nobody searched for this, how does that start to get filled? Well, in the immediate period, Google turns to other sources of textual information. It pulls data from Reddit and Twitter. YouTube doesn't. It waits for you to upload content to YouTube. So in situations like this, what happens is that different kinds of adversarial actors try to jump on that news story in order to shape the landscape. They immediately go, media manipulators, they immediately go to Twitter and to Reddit, trying to affect the things that will flow into Google. But they know that will only last for a period of time. So they also start to engage journalists. And the group who was really interested in this shooting, like is interested in most shootings in this country, is determined to associate shooters, particularly white male shooters, with a group that they identify as Antifa. So they want to stage a false equivalency to say that there's this group, Antifa, that is so much stronger than folks who are part of white supremacist and white nationalist groups. And by staging that at scale, by creating fake Antifa accounts all over Twitter, by participating in this, they can actually shape the discourse. So they did. They start pumping it. They start pumping in content saying the shooter was really Antifa. And journalists started trying to pay attention to this. And interestingly, a journalist who was targeted by these groups went straight to writing a very decent article about it for Newsweek. He went into detail about how the far-right groups were staging this process, and the article is actually pretty thoughtful. There's a problem, though. Look at that title. What you might notice about that title is it's long. Antifa responsible for Sutherland Springs murders, according to far-right media. The problem with that title is that Google cuts off after a few characters. So for the first 72 hours, if you searched for anything on Google related to this shooting, you saw at the top in the newsreel, Antifa responsible for Sutherland Springs murders. Okay? Now that wasn't just what was happening on Google. It was also happening on YouTube because videos were immediately put up by people who make videos trying to associate us accordingly. Right? This is a way of shaping during a breaking news story, a way of shaping the conversation space in a significant way. Now, YouTube takes a lot longer to clean up, right? It's a lot longer for material to come in, and it's a lot longer to clean up. And part of the problem in cleaning up YouTube is that there's not actually as quick of a news ecosystem. Yes, eventually ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, they all put their content in some way. They don't optimize for YouTube. They don't go through the details of the metadata. They don't work out exactly how this should be optimized. And so if the metadata isn't there and people aren't building the link structure within YouTube, that is not highly ranked, even if the content is there. So that's data void number 1. Data void number 2 has to do with the creation of strategic terms. So in the early 1990s, a political operative by the name of Frank Luntz became famous for really pithy talking points. He was really good at creating phrases and frames that would actually shape the public imaginary. And every week, he hosted a meeting with Republican staffers on the Hill in order to offer them a new phrase that they should aim to get into news media, so that they could create a drumbeat of terms, and that drumbeat of terms would be recognized by news media and amplified. And it was very effective. You know many of his terms: partial birth abortion, climate change, death tax. All of those are probably familiar to you. Those were Frank Lunt's terms. So when congressional members started using those terms, they managed to get the news media to do the work of amplifying that message. It created coherence. And when you have a term or a phrase that creates coherence, you actually see the shaping of a cultural logic. It's very effective. And regardless of what you feel about his particular terms, there is no question of his efficacy. Now, today, in the internet context, we no longer have Frank Luntz's per se. We have a lot of people throwing spaghetti at the wall with terms throughout a lot of different environments that you probably don't pay much attention to. And they try out terms to see what will get traction. And they move those terms up, but they do something different with their terms. Rather than just seeing if the term will make sense, they focus on creating tons of content around that term. They produce YouTube videos, they put the term throughout Wikipedia, they talk about the term on Twitter, they try to get the term everywhere so that it will shape the entire ecosystem. And then they target journalists to use that phrase. And what you see in extremist environments is a way of actually using this to take conspiratorial logics to the mainstream. So consider the term crisis actor. Many of you probably know this term by now. It emerged in online forums after Sandy Hook in extremist environments in order to undermine people who were speaking on TV about the massacre. By calling and labeling them crisis actors, conspiratorial and far-right extremist groups argued that Sandy Hook didn't happen, and that those who were talking about it on TV were actually hired by deep state actors to fake shootings in order to push gun control. This is conspiracy. And there were a large number of YouTube videos associated with that term, pushing that logic long before Parkland happened. But when Anderson Cooper asks David Hogg on national TV if he is a crisis actor, people start searching the term. And that's the point. Those who went to YouTube to figure out what this term was about were introduced to tremendous conspiratorial content. Now you've actually heard of many terms that were staged from extremist groups into the mainstream: incel, caravan, globalist, deep state, white genocide. Journalists do the work of conspiracy theory and far-right groups when they amplify the terms that have been staged for them. The goal here isn't to use journalists to just influence the public. In fact, journalists are actually there to target and shape the information landscape set up by Google and social media. In other words, by actually getting journalists to use phrases, it pushes it across search, and then you get people to go to the sites that actually have much more deep extremist white supremacist content. Welcome to the rabbit hole. The third kind of data void comes from terms that were once in common parlance and no longer are, particularly terms that are understood to be pejorative now at time. I'm going to use this term, and it's an offensive term, but I want to use it because you need to understand it in relation. But consider the term Negro. Like the N-word, this word is unquestionably pejorative and hateful. But unlike the N-word, it has not been reclaimed as an acceptable in-group term. As a result, there is very little content that is ever produced using this term. When you search on Google, you are immediately given information that signals that this term is outdated and offensive. There's enough context within history, enough content all over text-based environments to help you understand where this term comes from. That's not the case on YouTube. If you search for the N-word, you will get tons of content trying to educate you about the racist history of that term. But if you search for the term Negro, you will get archival material, including political references. So let's dig into that video with our former president. What happens when we click on that link? I get an uncritiqued clip of our former president making a very racist remark. And I get a slew of racist commentary that reaffirm that. And that's what starts to shape an ongoing thought logic within these environments once you start searching for terms that have been left behind. They've been left behind for reasons, but they're really problematic to come back to. Now, the fourth kind of data void comes from a problematic query, even more about asking a question that is not something people ever think through, not just things that are left behind, but things that are problematic throughout history. So who searches for did the Holocaust exist? Needless to say, people don't think to produce videos of that, right, to try to counteract conspiratorial logics at first. So the first result on YouTube begins with a Holocaust denier. Yes, you have a Wikipedia link at the top to tell you that this is Holocaust denial. But that's not actually the most interesting, because you click on that and you start watching some of the different comments below it. And like Godwin's law, where everything goes to Nazis in a matter of a few clicks, what you find is that it takes you no time to get reference to a video, the video that you should watch if you really want to understand the truth about Hitler. And that is a conspiracy video that is actually designed to tell you that there was no real Holocaust and to tell you the truth about what Hitler did. And that is considered the real red pill in a lot of Holocaust denial environments, the place that you get to. You get people to that video, and it's throughout all of the comments around here. Now, these 4 types of data voids highlight a major vulnerability in search. Search doesn't return high-quality content if there's little content to have available. But text-based search engines are a lot easier to clean up thanks to people who are engaged in the production of news. We have a much bigger problem in a video ecosystem. Much bigger problem in something that is simultaneously a search engine, a social media platform, and a recommendation engine. So let's actually talk about where that starts to intersect. I want to talk about what it means to deal with the recommendation engine problem that is YouTube, because these are where it crosses. When you watch a video on YouTube, you are given a slew of videos to watch that are recommended to you. Most importantly, when you finish a video, one auto plays out of the recommendations. Now, this is fantastic if you're listening to music. You end up getting exposed to all sorts of new and interesting music. But what happens when you're listening to political commentary, when you're listening to so-called news? Recommendation engines and autoplay features are designed to encourage you to continue to engage with a given service. The algorithms are constantly, quote-unquote, improved to maximize that outcome of engagement. The designers of these systems don't actually pay attention to the content. They pay attention to signals that are available to try to determine what makes something relevant from one person to another. So if someone watches video A and then watches video B, or better yet, actively comments on both, or likes, or forwards, or does a whole variety of other things, the next person to watch video A will then be likely to be recommended video B. Pretty simple, right? Now, of course, what you can probably gather by now is that that's something that can be exploited. That is something that the news community doesn't think to actually make those connections. They put up the videos, they leave the videos there, but this is something that quickly gets exploited. So consider what happens if you're searching for vaccination information on YouTube. Right? The first content you almost always get is actually high-quality video content. The Center for Disease Control, local health organizations explaining the conspiracy around anti-vaccination culture. They produce really responsible videos that, let's be honest, are a bit dry, but they're actually really well produced and informative. But the conspiratorial anti-vax community is hell-bent on getting their message of doubt into this environment to parents who might be wavering, who might be beginning to search to begin with. So many search engines have to struggle with the sophisticated SEO that these groups start to engage in. Now, YouTube has a different problem. If you watch a health organization's video and then follow the recommended video or do the autoplay, within 2 videos you will almost always be watching a conspiracy video. Why? Because the communities who are trying to shape these connections understand that comments matter. So within the anti-vaccine community, there's concerted effort to actually comment on both sites. They help shape the links, they make connections, they bridge things together outside of YouTube and bring them back together. They know that views matter, and they actually shape that connection. And you can build that connection between CDC and anti-vaccine communities in a way that actually is really concerted and cultivated to build that connection. And the result is that anybody who's searching is going to see that connection being made because the work done by YouTube doesn't actually see it as a topic. They see it as a set of signals. Now, my colleague Becca Lewis described another method to influence news content in her report, alternative influence. While the CDC will never host an anti-vaxxer into a debate about vaccination, many people in the political context think it's appropriate to create a form of false equivalency and have 2 people debating. This occurs on mainstream news, but it also occurs in YouTube. How it plays out in YouTube, though, really matters. Because mainstream commenters who host extremists in order to debate will actually send a signal to YouTube through that process that these two videos should be linked, so that the next people who are watching the mainstream viewer will likely be recommended to the extremist views that are coming out. Right? This is a way of creating a pathway and a connection. It's a way of manipulating the actual network graph of these systems. So you end up going to YouTube for reasonably informed information, and within a few places, you are exposed to a lot of extremist content. Now, when people first hear about this dynamic, they immediately say, let's remove this content. And I really get that impulse, right? I am not a fan of the anti-vax dynamic at all. And there's a lot of hateful and conspiratorial content, and I have sympathy for trying to get rid of all of it. But there's a problem as you start to think about where this goes in the long term. Now, YouTube has gotten rid of a lot of content, it's downweighted other content, and there's a lot more that's terrible. But what's interesting is how creators who have an agenda, like is seen in the anti-vaccine communities, actually know how to skirt a line. Right? After all, anti-vax content doesn't tell you that vaccinations are dangerous. They invite you to question and doubt it. Right? That's the process, is to see doubt, to ask you to question whether or not they're safe. And that's much harder to talk about whether we talk about removal. Also, we have a challenge of like how the edges are of content that is 100% in a sort of particular political ideology, but may not be extremist. How many of you watch PragerU videos? How many of you are familiar with PragerU videos? Wow, I expected to have a lot more of you considering the range of places you come from. PragerU is produced by Dennis Prager, a conservative talk show host. They produce a video a week, and their goal is to undo the quote-unquote leftist messages produced by universities. Their videos are popular on YouTube, but they're especially popular on Facebook. Their CEO claims that 1/3 of all US Facebook users watched a PragerU video on Facebook. Now that's really significant, because if you talk to people who are teaching in universities right now, they're constantly now getting questions that come from watching PragerU. Now, they exploit the data void structure on YouTube in order to get people to doubt normative views. They don't necessarily send hateful messages. They just get you to see doubt. So if you're a teenager who's been first exposed to the term, say, social justice, you read it in some history book or whatever, and you throw it into YouTube, you won't get a conversation about the history of the term social justice or the different movements that are involved in it. You will get a PragerU video telling you that this term is a propagandist term that is actually not really meant to help you, but is actually meant to harm you. And it's done because, it works because racial justice movements have left behind the term social justice. So they're no longer producing new content related to it. Now, implicit in their message is a specific idea of you. That you in their message is typically Christian and it's typically white. Now, once you watch one PragerU video, you will be given a non-stop stream of them, because there are hundreds of them. So perhaps you will actually get the video called Why No One Trusts the Mainstream News, which undoes a lot of the projects of the people in this room. Or perhaps you will get the video on what they haven't told you about climate change. Now let's check that one out for a second. YouTube recognizes it's in contested territory, so it produces Wikipedia. This is the problem with how they put Wikipedia. But the question is how they got to that phrase, right? Because they didn't put climate change, the Wikipedia entry on climate change. They put the Wikipedia entry on global warming, another left behind term. So you click on that, or you search for global warming, which is a reasonable thing to do on YouTube, and what's the first thing that you get? Hoax videos, right? Climate change denial videos. And you're through these paths over and over again. But the difficulty with these paths is that most of them are not total disinformation. They are actually just doubting the current ways of thinking. They are inviting you to question, to see doubt, to look for more information, to do your research. Right? And that is a very familiar campaign. In fact, Russia Today had a brilliant and long-standing campaign called Question More. Right? And so when YouTube is actually called out for, or sued in many cases, for removing content that is deemed to be conspiratorial, which they are, that is often charged of censorship. right? That's how they sort of push back. The same thing actually occurred with Russia Today, right? Because when they put these posters around, right, the idea is climate change more science fiction than science fact, and inviting you to actually question more, to consume all sides of the news. They put these up, and the UK responded by removing them. And of course, what that meant is RT put up ads saying, this is what happens, right? Redacted censorship. Now, I'm not convinced that actually removing this content gets us anywhere. It just creates different kinds of polarization. Do I believe some content needs to go? Absolutely. But I think we need to think about where the power in this dynamic goes. Right? The power in this dynamic is about taking you from a place of curiosity into a place of extremism. And how do we understand that link? I actually think there's another way to approach this, and I'm personally fond of the approach Spotify uses. So I don't know how many of you use Spotify, but you know when you start to listen to something and you're like in a groove and then suddenly you're interrupted and you're like, not that, right? That's a terrible thing. Well, there's certain things that are known to be massive disruptions. So no matter how much you might like Mariah Carey and you're grooving to We Belong Together, there is a decent chance that you don't want All I Want for Christmas Is You, right? Because if you're really listening to like Mariah Carey's latest hits or long-standing, or you don't necessarily want her Christmas album, right? Christmas albums are a distraction unless you're already in the Christmas album thing, right? Because once you're in the Christmas album thing, all you want is Christmas music, right? So it's understood as like a separate universe. Same, by the way, with kids' music, right? You might like They Might Be Giants, but you don't want their kids' album unless you're already there. Now, the way that they deal with that is that they create structures to say that one path should not lead to another. And how do you actually understand that? That requires being aware of content. That requires really understanding context. And that requires actually operationalizing a theory of power into the technology itself. Now, the challenge with this is who gets to decide what is conspiratorial, what is legitimate difference of opinion, and what is an appropriate theory of power to talk about. When should disagreements be bridged, and when should people be exposed to a different perspective? Now, if it's not obvious from my comments, I have a very specific scientific way of thinking. I believe in climate science. I believe in vaccination. I believe in the Holocaust. And I don't actually have acceptance for the things that are in those conspiratorial logics. And in my head, the idea that there are sides about this debate is a false equivalency that is produced in an irresponsible and dangerous way. Right? That's my value system. But the lines aren't always so clear. I gave you things that I think are relatively clear. But as a researcher, I realize that people hold contradictory and different opinions. I respect that one person's religion is another person's myth. I recognize that political comments are actually nuanced. And when it comes to knowledge, I accept that people hold different epistemologies. In other words, how people build a sense of knowledge varies tremendously. I might be wedded to scientific and rational approaches, but some people actually start with experience or faith, and I respect that. Now, since our friend Eli Pariser, who's in the room, first coined the term, many people have lamented the presence of filter bubbles on social media. In the political context, they're seen as dangerous, especially on sites like Facebook. And it means that people end up in this environment. So we talk about what it means to be exposed to the other side, right? But researchers struggle with this because often people self-segregate, regardless of what the algorithms recommend. They push and they double down on a world that's just like them. And so when is it appropriate for a recommendation engine to provide new information? Is that actually helping inform people, or is that proselytizing? Is that in itself an act of power that needs to be contested? And what happens when the starting point is in two radically different places? My colleague Francesca Tripodi wrote a beautiful book, paper called Searching for Alternative Facts, which is actually available outside, that describes the moment when she was sitting in a Bible study in Virginia. Now, after spending an hour sort of interpreting a particular biblical passage, the pastor brought up the tax reform bill. This wasn't something that she was expecting. But diving into a particular passage in the tax reform bill, the pastor encouraged the congregants to apply the same kind of scriptural sense-making that they applied to the Bible, that they should apply to the political text. And through a process of working through what that text said, they came to an interpretation that is fundamentally different from what you would hear from political wonks in DC. That's interesting, right? Why does it mean that the same text can be used to make different meaning? Now, she goes on to talk about how this same practice of scriptural inference is applied to Google searches. Instead of using the search engine to research a topic, many of the evangelical communities that she talked to talked about going to Google in order to get affirmation of something. And she tried to understand what that was about. And she realized that she was listening to talk radio and to a bunch of the different kinds of media that this community was consuming, that they were being told how to search. And that the process and project of going to a search engine is to figure out the right search query before you even begin. That if you're looking for the wrong search query, you get the wrong information. You have to look for the right query. And the question then is, who produces the right query? Right? We're back to the manipulation part. Because where people start from sends people down fundamentally different information paths. So what does that mean in practice? Consider the difference in YouTube for searching for Vatican pedophiles versus Vatican sexual abuse. My guess is that for those of you in the news business, you used one of these terms and not the other. Now, YouTube, in this context, collapsed the notion of gay and homosexuality, so that if you search for Vatican gay or Vatican homosexuality, you get to the same content. It's a lot more tricky to start to collapse the idea of sexual abuse and pedophiles, or to collapse homosexuality with pedophiles, right? There we've got a problem. Now, where you start doing that on the back end, actually, no matter what, shapes what people do, because the result is that these terms send you down entirely different paths. Your information landscape, your recommendation engines, everything shapes based on even how you begin this process. She was also talking to a bunch of voters during a primary election. She wanted to figure out how candidates would figure out who they vote for. Now, she was in Virginia, and everybody around her told her that they didn't trust fake news, by which they meant CNN. So she knew that they were going to find a different path that was not about news, per se. They were going to try to find a different way of making sense. So she was expecting to hear about community and all of these ways of trying to sense things. And so they were like, no, we go to Google. She was like, oh, okay, I know how to go to Google to search, right? And as an academic, she was like, great. And she was sitting down trying to make sense of it. It's like, why is this so problematic? And then she realized something important. They didn't search to go look at content. They didn't click on the content. They put side by side all of the different candidates within a primary to see what Google would offer up, because Google provided all sides, and they felt as though this would provide perspective. In other words, those headlines that are written, the little clips, they mattered more than anything. Same ends up being true on YouTube. So much of it is not about watching the video, but watching what are the little clips, or what are the kinds of comments that surface up, the things that surround it, the text that is meant to get you to click on it. Only it doesn't get you to click on it. It ends up being the end of the story, not the beginning of it. Now, this was not how Google was designed. In fact, when we talked to Google engineers about the fact that people were doing, they flipped out, right? Because Google is explicitly not designed to be liberal or conservative, no matter how many times you're told otherwise. But it is designed to be data-driven. It does have an epistemology that assumes that the knowledge is within the data. And it does assume that people will click through and not simply read the headlines. Now, this is a fallacy that we struggle with in general, right? Those in the field of journalism know that there's a constant struggle about what those headlines do. Are those headlines trying to get your people in to read, or do they do the work on their own? It's not just that people don't read the headlines on Google. They often perceive the world through the notifications, through the little bits that they see, through what people post around the content on Twitter or Facebook. And that's where it's a struggle, because you're not just controlling misinformation with the actual content that we spend so much time focusing on. You're dealing with it with the surround information. And that's what we know exploiters know how to exploit. Now, misinformation is not a new problem, nor is the exploitation of the media ecosystem. Whenever new medium gains power, there are people who exploit it for all sorts of personal or organizational gain. Whether for profit, for ideology, for political gain, media manipulators leverage vulnerabilities in the information landscape to achieve specific goals. Unfortunately, engineers design for how they hope the tool might be used. Journalists write for how they hope the information might be consumed. Policymakers create laws about how they hope it will make certain kinds of change. Most people who like to build, right, like to create, like to inform, imagine all of the awesome ways in which their creations might be used. They don't like to think about how they might be exploited. We all hope for what will happen so that we can actually justify the actions we've taken, rather than struggle with all of the terrible things that might happen as a byproduct of our very, very good intentions. Now, Needless to say, I would love for us to get better at building the structures and processes to proactively think about how things might go wrong. I really relish the security community for actually spending time thinking about how a system can be exploited in order to build up resilience and thinking of it as an ongoing process. I think that that mindset is really critical for community and for news, right? Thinking about how things will go wrong in order to make them better, walking it back and forth. But it is a particular kind of mindset for certain people, not for others. And building the right structures to allow people to imagine a future that is amazing and imagine all the terrible things that go wrong is a really hard organizational challenge. But I also want to point out that this is a form of institutional friction, right? Putting that in is hard. And our culture wars, as we look at them, we don't like to actually find the hard ways through. We like to find the things that we can blame or the one thing that we could fix. And right now, that conversation about technology. Culture wars of today were not created by technology, but they are amplified by it. So the cultural wars we're facing right now, I argue, are actually rooted in epistemological fragmentation. And that is like painful academic verbose commentary, so let me unpack it. The differences between how people actually build knowledge is fracturing the very social fabric of this country and vice versa. It's happening along countless dimensions, although it's most visible right now, especially in this room, to political debates and to the access of information. So let's talk about news, because I know a lot of you are really invested in it, and all of you, as you state, at least consume it. It's easy to say that people who might watch, say, Fox or CNN see the world differently. What's more concerning is that they're increasingly less likely to know each other. They don't know that they're consuming content. They don't know that they're approaching different frames. Equally troubling is that the kinds of structures that actually allow those networks to occur, to allow the communities to come together to bridge those sources of networks, have disappeared. Let's unpack that. Local news played many important roles in our social fabric, and I commend Alberto for putting that at the front and center of the night's mission. Now, many people focus on the substantive, and that's awesome, especially from the journalistic community. But I actually want to focus on the structural role that local news played. Because of local news, people knew people in the business of news, and therefore were more likely to trust the business of news. If you don't know anybody in news, you do not trust the business of news, and the national news becomes a real foreign actor. Local news also provided a bridge to that national news. It allowed for it to be locally contextualized, and a lot of local news did that work. So it wasn't just about reporting on the local information, it was about building that conceptual connection. Now, local news also anchored epistemological difference. It allowed in papers, even in cities that had multiple papers with different political ideologies, it allowed a way of actually seeing the world different and seeing within the range of views of the community. And this occurred through the range of different media, whether we're talking ethnic media, or in some cases across one particular entity. But all of that was a tremendous community service. Unfortunately, it's not a business, certainly not in the current way that capitalism is architected. So I've been really struggling. I still don't understand why neither community members nor the news industry seems to understand the power of hedge funds and private equity in reshaping this business. Since the takeover years of the 1980s, financiers ate up local organizations to extract real estate. It was about your communities and the real estate that you had. And sure, kind of put up with having these enterprises, letting them go along, took money out of in the ways, took over all of the board seats. I don't think someone in this room knows the percentage of board seats that are actually done by financiers. But the structural value of local news was never of interest to the financial sector. And that's where it becomes a really interesting challenge when we see the switch to the tech industry. Now, the tech industry, of course, affected the business, but the business was actually set up to fail by the financiers long before the internet came about. Major tech, on the other hand, was actually built in response to the takeover culture of the 1980s. That's one of the reasons why you see these controls over stocks, these attempts to not let hedge funds and private equity take into account, a belief within tech that we can do this better and we can do this right, and why we're at a moment right now where we can't think about accountability within these environments. But the thing about tech is that tech fundamentally focuses on abstraction. It focuses on generalization, on scale, and above all, on growth. And when you think in terms of abstraction, you lose all of the local value, all of the structure there. So when an abstracted entity tries to produce local information, it will fail because it's not actually rooted within community. Tech knows how to universalize. It knows how to scale. It does not know how to bring it down to the root of local communities. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this fragmentation of epistemology. Now, our society isn't simply divided. It's fragmented and increasingly fragmenting. Many of us have the ability to choose who we want to be surrounded by, and that's really important because it's actually really rewarding to be surrounded by people who share our world. But the flip side of that, of course, is echo chambers. And it's really hard to build a society with people who share different epistemologies. Nowhere is that clearer than when we look around the globe and think about the role that religion as a form of epistemology plays. How many countries have gone into civil war over different religious differences? Bridging fundamental differences in epistemology is a societal project, one that countries have continuously struggled over, including in this country. Getting out of that is hard, and it's not simply about information. It's about really humanizing and building those connections in the local fabric to build it up as a whole. Now, one of the weird things about war in this country is that the military is actually a social project itself. You learn to be vulnerable with other people, to find common ground across difference, to lay down your life for somebody who views the world differently than you do for a common cause. This isn't accidental. This is how soldiers are made. And that's the funny thing, is that we actually have had all of these projects in the United States at a national scale. American universities, military, other structures that brought people together across difference and allowed them to be vulnerable together so that they could build up community in a sophisticated way. Of course, all of those are under attack in different ways. And many of you in the room are involved in community. Many of you know how to bring people together for a common cause. And that is utterly critical, because we need that now more than ever. It's not just about coordinating people to achieve something, but to understand that when you bring people together, you are purposefully and intentionally building the networks of community, building the fundamental social fabric. Facebook may have thought of itself as modeling the graph of this country, but you who are in community need to actually build those networks and to build them smartly. It's not just about building people who are of the same kind, but building people who actually bridge across that. Because when we look at things like YouTube, resilience is not about removing certain content. Resilience is about having networks of people that you can turn to, that you can ask questions of, that you can make sense of. They knit people together. And that's where I was really delighted with the last recommendation from the Knight Commission. Because the Commission recommended a commitment to national service. And this is a conversation Alberto and I've had in different versions for a decade. This can be read as a project to give back, but it can also be strategically built to actually build the networks of the community. To really think not just about doing it as a militaristic project, but a way of really being smart about building people who are different than one another, putting them into a situation to do something together that makes a big difference. And that's what it means to actually think about diversity. Diversity is not about categories and demographics. It is about getting people across the variety of experiences that they have to intentionally contribute to community. So in closing, I want to say truth is fragmenting. It will continue to do so until we recognize that what's at stake isn't simply about information. It's how we're building an understanding of the world around us. And I want you to understand that there are many Band-Aids that we can build, but the real solution actually comes down to thinking about the communities that we all live in, thinking about information as a thing that actually bridges across those communities, and being smart and strategic about that. If you want to address the vulnerabilities that I talked about upstream in this talk, the key is to get down into the roots and actually address those communities. Many of us who built social media imagined that we would do it just by building the networks. We were wrong. We need you. We need you to actually be doing it in community around this country so that we can actually be resilient to all of the information environment issues we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you. We have mic runners throughout the room. We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Fun part. Where are you going?
Hi, Danah. I appreciate the Richard Adler from Institute for the Future and Aspen Institute. I appreciate the focus on local, and I think that's exactly right. But I am curious whether you think there are some smart ways of dealing with the YouTube and the data void problems on the tech level, that you identified the problems. I wasn't sure if I heard solutions there.
Right. Well, Mostly, I understand most of you are not the tech industry. I spend a lot of time in that conversation. There are some very simple things for this room, which is one, get your content onto all of the sites that people go to, right? That's a really simple thing. Learn how to optimize. That is a Band-Aid. It is not a fix to the tech industry problem, but it's a way of at least buffering some of what's going on. And this is really important on topics of civic interest. In terms of the tech industry, I think part of why I highlighted Spotify as an example is that there's actually ways to start understanding the content and the context. And the smartest moves that I'm seeing in industry are trying to recognize that there is context. The next major move is to really actually understand power within the data infrastructure, right? Understanding that links are not actually just bidirectional. And this is what we'll get into like esoteric technical pieces, but like as a grounded example, Twitter, you know it to be directional, which is to say you can follow somebody and they don't have to follow you. Well, you can actually start to analyze harassment when you actually follow those structures. Because if you've got a dog pile, a bunch of people from a community piling up on somebody in a coordinated fashion, that is most likely harassment or certainly something to look at, right? But it's actually about understanding the structure. Most of the tech industry conversation historically has been about looking at the content. It really is the context, and so it requires a fundamental change in every aspect of moderation. There's another piece that's out in the hallway by Robin Kaplan called Content or Context Moderation. This is another great piece that sort of looks at the dynamics that are playing out in that way. So again, for those who really want to talk tech industry, I'm happy to go down that. But I think that it's sort of, there are pieces that they can do, but at the end of the day, even if they take many of the smart moves that they should take, they're not going to address the different fabrics that actually are happening within community. And so that's one of the reasons, especially in this room, I really want you to recognize that there will be no magic fix in tech, because even if it goes away, the problems that we're facing are still here.
Thank you. We have a question back here.
Hi. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think this attitude that we often have that, like, these opinions are extremists and we shouldn't deal with them, when you have half of the country that believes those things and they hear us talking about them like they're extremists and their viewpoints aren't worthy of consideration, to what extent do you think that has contributed to the decline in the media and the business model? Thank you.
So I think one of the hardest things as a project of a society is to figure out the bounds of what is considered to be acceptable conversation and not. And I am a believer that anything that starts with a premise of doing harm to other people, anything that starts with a premise of violence, anything that starts with a premise of purposefully hurting people at scale needs to be called into question as extremism. I think that we've got some of the hardest issues in front of us, and I think that we need to grapple with why people come from those places, why they get there, how they deal with it. But I don't believe that there are things that we can just fundamentally accept and tolerate, and I'm not willing to tolerate especially racist hate as something that just most people believe. I think that that needs to be called into question, and that's, to me, where values come in. I'm more than willing to sit down and talk with somebody who espouses those views, but I'm not willing to propagate their messages, and I don't think that the folks in this room should either. And I think that's part of the social project. And what I would say there, in conclusion, is that when you are in a position of power, like many of you in this room are, you are in a position where you choose what to amplify. Be strategic about what you amplify, certainly for those of you who are in the news business, right? Choosing to amplify messages that bring community together rather than amplifying false equivalencies. Choosing to amplify the messages that are trying to actually address the inequities in the society rather than to amplify hate. Those are choices that people make, and those are choices that anybody in a position of power should be really thoughtful about making. And I believe we should be calling into question those in power who want to actively seek discord, because that's how societies fall. And let's be honest, this society is, a country is a social imaginary. We only exist to the degree that we can work together to imagine it. And if we actively and committedly start to amplify things that imagine our fray, we will create our discord. We will create our division. And that's what I'm worried that we're doing right now, because we think it's just a matter of reporting the discord, when actually what we're doing is amplifying and creating it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, please.
Hi, Danah. Thanks for this great talk. I'm Heather Chaplin from Journalism and Design. I have a question I'd love your thoughts on, and it might sound a little bit naive, so I hope you all will bear with me and believe me that it comes from many years of research and thinking about these issues. But it seems to me that from what you've been talking about, that we have a system that's being really successfully gamed. And you're always going to have people who are willing to do things that other people aren't willing to do, to actively manipulate, actively be dishonest. And can you imagine some sort of future system that is resilient and robust enough to keep that from happening, or is that just an inherent problem?
So part of it is, I mean, I shouldn't be telling you this, but like, because you and I have had this conversation, which is that power, 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 power. When there are actors in a position of power, somebody is going to try to exploit, try to gain power, try to manipulate those that are in power. That is always the case. In fact, one of the reasons that I love going back to some of the documents of the founding of this country are different actors in this country trying to struggle with how to build structures of power. So like, one of the things that I love about George Washington, he actually said very little during the conversations around the Constitutional Convention and trying to figure it out. In fact, he pretty much didn't talk, except for one thing. He argued vehemently that our apportionment in this country had to be 30,000 people, not 40,000 people, because above 30,000 people, we would never trust people, because we would be too far removed from the actors of power, and we would seek to have other structures that would manipulate them. We are at apportionment of 170,000 people. We're in a different kind of place. So part of it is that I don't believe that you can build a system that has power that is resilient to attempts to manipulate that power. The naivety of those of us who were in the tech sector 15 years on was that we actually didn't imagine that we would ever have power. We were the self-identified geeks, freaks, and queers, and I was all three, so I was like, win, right? But like, at that moment, you didn't think that the institutions that you were building would ever have power. And so that's part of the naivety in building these systems, and they're like, whoa, people see us as having power, and much of Silicon Valley still doesn't think that they've got power, and you're sitting here going, guys, should we look at your finances alone? So like, this is where you have to actually understand power. You really fundamentally do. And that's one of the reasons that I do keep going back to security. When you understand power, whether you talk about geopolitical power for which security is played out, or whether we talk about technical power, you realize that security is not about making something that is secure. You realize it's about a constant and ongoing process of thinking with your adversaries and moving forward. Right? But this is not just about an adversarial dynamic. This is also about the idea of anything that we talk about as risk. Those of us who are sort of spent a lot of time in health professions, we know when we moved from talking about safe sex to safer sex, right? Because what the heck is safe sex, right? There is a fundamental risk in sexual contact with somebody, and like a delightful joy that we usually outweigh. But the result is that when we think about that, if you tell people like it's fundamentally safe, you've got a problem at the very basic level of having your heart broken, right? So like a huge chunk of it is about building a way of thinking sophisticatedly about what risk looks like. And we talk about risk at an individual level, at an organizational level, and at a societal level. And in this context, this is where we're struggling with a moment where tech is thinking still about risk at an organization level, right? What's the risk to their business? What's the risk to their reputation? But we need to be looking holistically at the risk at a societal level. And that puts tech in a very different position, and one that's really challenging. But tech is never going to be in a position, especially not as a corporatized, financialized entity, to be the one thinking about it at a societal level. That should never be one entity. Right? There shall be no king, as Eli's constantly reminding me of. Like, this is about thinking about what the project as a whole is. And with that, I am told to send you off to other fun and interesting things.
Thank you, Danah. Thank you.